Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gary Parker. I am the Associate Dean for External Affairs at the Brown School at Washington University, where I also have the great privilege of serving as the inaugural director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute. And welcome to Open Classroom. This is the Brown School's digital forum for learning and a community colloquium, allowing us to come together around important community issues. I want to thank our Director of Professional Development, Janet Gillow, who's behind the scenes, who has really built this platform into something extraordinary. I'm going to put a link out there to let you know about our upcoming programming. One I thought might be of interest is on April 4th. It's called Deconstructing Inclusion, Beyond a Seat at the Table. We are producing that event in partnership with the Grand Challenges for Social Work, the Network for Social Work Management, and Influencing Social Policy. One note about today's programming: if you would like to submit a question, please send it in through the Q&A feature, and we will hand that over to Dr. Barnes. This is part of our Black History Month programming, and I'm sad to say it's the final piece for this year as the month has come to an end. But there have been so many wonderful programs. Also going to put out a link there to the Brown School's Black History Month website. The recordings for all of the programs are available there. Some of the really wonderful programming is Professionalism, a Racist Construct, towards a more racially just St. Louis. And the next person I'm going to introduce is really responsible for lifting up a lot of our Black History Month programming. So please give a warm welcome to our Assistant Dean for Community Partnerships, Cynthia Williams. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, thank you, Gary. This afternoon, we are very fortunate to conclude our formal programming for 2022 Black History Month with Dr. Sheretta Butler-Barnes. Dr. Barnes is a developmental psychologist and has expertise in scholarly work on the impact of racism and the use of culturally strength-based assets on the educational and health outcomes of Black American families. Her research agenda includes, but is not limited to, how Black youth draw on personal and cultural assets and resources to thrive despite challenges to their identities from institutional and personal experience of racism, as well as advancing equitable learning environments for Black women and girls. But on a personal note, it's my opinion that if there were an equivalent to Mount Rushmore in celebration of Blackness, Dr. Butler-Barnes would be among the faces memorialized. She is a highly respected, trusted friend, colleague, mentor, and researcher at the Brown School. Welcome, Sheretta.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. And if you can let me know if you can see this, this would be great. Can you all see this? Yes, you can? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for this introduction. And also just for creating this space and allowing me to be here to talk about some of the work that I've been doing, particularly as it surrounds Black girls. And so while we know it's the end of Black History Month, it is Women's History Month. So I think that this is sort of right on time. And so again, I'm a developmental psychologist. My name is Sheretta Butler-Barnes. And title of this talk today is going to be on Raising Queens, the important role of racial socialization in the lives of Black girls. And so before I get started, I'd like to just give you all an overview of what I will be discussing today. First of all, I'm going to be talking about the research literature, particularly how the research has sort of situated Black girls, and also what we know about Black girls' development from the research literature. I'm going to talk about a guiding framework that is very useful and is useful in a way in which I situate and talk about the work that I do with Black families, being that it has to be rooted and it has to be culturally affirming. And then I'm going to talk about some results and really how researchers and organizations that service Black girls can be intentional about creating Black girl space and what that might look like. But before I get started, I want to start off with my positionality and how I sort of came to this work. And so I am from Detroit, Michigan. from a lower middle class family background. I'm the oldest of two siblings. I attended K through 12 programming, gifted and talented programming in Detroit public schools, K through 12, and then went on to Michigan State, Wayne State University, and University of Michigan for my postdoc. And so what does all of this mean in the work and the way I situate Black girls? And so being that attending Detroit public schools in these gifted and talented programs, they were predominantly Black institutions. And so very early on, I was sort of situated in spaces where I understood and was surrounded by within group diversity of the way that Black Americans position themselves, Black students. So around this within group diversity, because what we know from the research literature is that Black families tend to be viewed, or Black students tend to be viewed in a very monolith lens. And so for me, it was this sort of diversity within group diversity among Black Americans. So that sort of shaped the work that I do now. And then getting to spaces of predominantly white institutions like Michigan State University, Wayne State, and University of Michigan, where I am now sort of being presented as a psychology major with theories on family development that excluded Black families. And so again, I sort of had this moment of, okay, well, this is not the way that I grew up, or this is not my lived experience, or Black families are not a monolith, it shouldn't be viewed in this way. This is sort of not consistent with my worldview, because the models that were presented were based on white middle class families. And so for me, it led to becoming a developmental psychologist, being intentional about using a culturally strength-based lens, and also finding ways in which Black families engage in resilient strategies and resisting strategies to reclaim and retell their own stories. And then also I'm the mother of two Black girls. And so this is how I sort of show up to this work. And this is why I'm intentional about using culturally affirming methods, theory, and tools and programming, really to sort of show the beauty and the within group diversity of Black families. And so I thought that was sort of important to say in how I situate myself. And so now we get to the research with Black girls and what this topic is about. And so throughout my journey as a developmental psychologist in developmental science, the group that has been consistently invisible, the group that has when we talk about or present findings on gender, they're sort of, we have Black men and we have Black boys. And when we're talking about women's issues, Black girls sort of are washed away because it's sort of centered on white women's experiences. And so what we have here is, and it's starting to increase, but we at a time had a dearth of research literature that really sort of explored Black girls, and particularly Black girlhood, and why that was important. And so what do we know from the research literature when it comes to racial discrimination experiences, which even go back to what Sojourner Truth was talking about in her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman? And when we get to Mary Church Terrell or Ida B. Wells, really arguing for the way in which how Black women show up, but when they show up, Black women and girls, they're often viewed as invisible. And so what we know is that the racial discrimination literature, that Black girls who experience racial discrimination, this is associated with lower school importance. And so they think that school is unimportant if they're in these contexts where they are experiencing racial discrimination. In a recent study, Carter Andrews found that Black girls were often labeled in classrooms as unintelligent, disruptive, rowdy, ghetto. And they also reported that Black girls reported in the study being policed and silenced in ways that white girls were not being policed and silenced. And what's interesting about this particular study was that this was a high performing school setting. So again, we're talking about context. And so lastly, even Black girls who perceive that society held sort of these higher assumptions of criminality. And this can be just something as simple as, Black girls responding to a question, because of my race, someone avoided walking near me on the street. They reported higher mental health outcomes. And so again, we're seeing how racial discrimination has shown up for Black girls, but in more recent times, right? More recently, within the past, I could say 5 years, we've been seeing an increase in this particular scholarship, which I am happy to see. And so, however, experiencing racial discrimination can lead to racial stigma. And this is associated with these sort of social categories that individuals put us in which others are holding negative stereotypes, attitudes, and beliefs about oneself. And social cognition theory states that the way in which humans process and store information that they encounter on a daily basis, this shapes their social identities. And so the way in which Black girls are experiencing racial discrimination within these school settings, this is why it was associated with lower school importance. This is why it's associated with higher mental health sort of outcomes, these sort of mental health symptoms. And so this is particularly important because this racial discrimination is sort of shaping your identity, your social identity, and how you believe about yourself. And thus, being a person of color and being in a marginalized position may have an impact on shaping one's attitudes and belief in both positive and negative ways. And so I get to the positive and negative ways of a little bit later on when we talk about the role of racial socialization. And so what does this mean for Black girls? And so more specifically, members of the out group are viewed based on physical sort of characteristics, physical markers that can have negative connotations. What we know from the research literature, and also I'm a big historian, what history tells us is that Black women and girls have always sort of been compared to not having white femininity standards of beauty. And so we see this when we look at when we see on social media that Black girls are being over-disciplined for what they wear, when we see that Black girls are being policed in ways that white girls aren't, when we see issues around hair, when Black girls are being suspended. And so again, these sort of physical markers can sort of lead to the way in which out-group members view this can lead to stigmatization. And so racial stigma is perpetuated by society's negative schemas of racial and ethnic minority groups. Media also feeds into this. What we typically see feeds into this. So it's not that Black girls are going out in these spaces and are just experiencing this in the school context, but it could be within the community, it could be within the neighborhood, it could be in place, it could be at one's employment. And so in a study that I did, I found that racial stigma for Black girls was indeed associated with poor psychosocial adjustment among Black girls. And so what does this lead up to? Well, in a national report conducted at Georgetown, the title of the report is Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. They found that among adults, that sort of, adults were asked about their views about certain adolescents and views about them. Black girls, in comparison to white girls, were viewed as needing less nurturing, needing less protection. They needed to be supported less, comforted less, that Black girls were more independent, almost adult-like, that they automatically, for some reason, knew more about adult topics, and that they always wanted to talk about sex. And I say this to say that this report was done in 2017. But I want to put a couple of books out there, Crescent City, and I also want to put Black Girlhood out, which sort of documented narratives and went back and did archival research in the mid-19th century. And these same conversations were happening with Black girls after slavery. And so again, this has sort of been a continuation of the way in which Black girls are sort of situated in the research literature and how society has viewed Black girls. And so when I'm thinking about the way that Black girls are stigmatized, it is a result of these sort of societal structures around racism and sexism in society that have impacted Black girls over time. And this is where we get to racial socialization, the importance of the talk, the way in which it's referred to in the media. And so racial socialization represents families' communications about how youth are thinking about their racial group membership and how they understand and cope with racial discrimination. And Peters back in 1985 said that racial socialization is a task that Black families have to do and is a cultural sort of way in which we have that and we share that amongst Black families in preparing our children for a racialized society. And so empirical research links racial socialization messaging to higher adaptive coping, in terms of discrimination. And also it's been linked to racial identity. And so what does this mean? Having conversations about who youth are, what they might encounter, messages around barriers that they may encounter, but also this teaching racial pride, this shapes who they are in positive ways. It also shapes the way in which they're actively sort of coping with discrimination that they have. This work really also has implications for what children are learning within school settings, which we see is an issue nationally and which it shouldn't be, right? And so racial socialization is particularly important. Now, how does this show up for Black girls? Well, a limited number of studies, they found some gender differences. Some studies have not found any gender differences, but for those studies that have found it, they found differences. They found that Black boys are more likely to receive messages that alert them to the existence of racial discrimination, which is sort of racial barrier messaging, and that Black girls are more likely to receive cultural messages around heritage and racial pride, which gets at to loving themselves and loving the who they are and how they show up, and just even how this is linking to conversations that we have about colorism, which is also something that's important that Black girls sort of have to contend with. And so there are definitely some mixed findings, but overall, racial socialization, I hypothesize, is particularly important for Black girls. And so just in thinking about my positionality, right, how I came to this work and how I came to this work sort of being an intentional disruptor, right, to tell a narrative of Black families from a strength-based lens, and to be intentional about doing that because of my own lived experiences, I wanted to use a construct of racial socialization that was culturally affirming, that sort of centered and honored the strengths of Black families. And so I picked Howard Stevenson's sort of conceptualization of racial socialization from his work in 1994. And I also want to add to you all, there are several racial socialization scales that are out there and people conceptualize them different. And so if you are indeed interested in this line of work, it's important that you sort of understand what sort of messaging that you are interested in, and the way in which and how you think this might help Black families. But for me, I was interested in the multidimensional construct. Why? Because it pulled on the strengths of culturally affirming assets from the research literature that was found, right? And so one of the things we know is the perception of education. We know in the Black community that education has always been important. This is why we have our HBCUs now. That have started off. We have the Brown versus Board of Education decision. We have the Black church's role in education. And so this sort of racial socialization mechanism really emphasizes the importance of prepping Black children for experiences and messages of racism as it occurs in educational settings. Now, if you know anything about school discipline, in school, out of school suspensions, we know that Black boys and girls are overrepresented. So this conversation matters. In terms of extended family, the important role of relatives, blood and non-blood, can play in child rearing and family management. So this gets at our kinship support. Spirituality, according to the Pew Research Foundation, African Americans are some of the most religious groups in the United States. So the family teaching and practices around religion was particularly important for me. And also racism in society. We have parents having intentional conversations about the racist societal attitudes and behaviors that Black children are likely to face. Child rearing as it relates to the survival of the family for the future. This gets into some of the Kwanzaa principles that we see here. This gets into the way in which Black families have had to resist and had to sort of reclaim their experiences since slavery. So this idea of child rearing and how surviving in the future. And lastly, the African American heritage and pride is just pretty much teaching about the significant contributions of our ancestors, about Black culture and about Black history. And so for me, using this multidimensional construct, I wanted to pull on a construct that was sort of rooted, that was culturally affirming, that I knew was important for Black families in rearing children and how to sort of live and cope in a racist society. And so now this gets to my guiding framework. In the same way that I was intentional about how my positionality sort of shaped the family racial socialization multidimensional construct, I'm very also intentional about the framework that I use to tell this story. And this is particularly important because as a scholar, if we are not grounding and rooting ourselves in theories that that sort of tell the truth about Black families' experiences, that also highlight the strengths, I think that we're doing a disservice. And so with this particular model, the integrative model for the study of stress in Black American families, I had the opportunity to work with a wonderful team from Vanderbilt University in developing this model with them. And what was very important about this model and why I'm using it in this study is this idea of understanding how the historical vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow laws impacts Black families today in terms of the race-related economic, social, and political histories of how we're situated, and how I told you all about the experiences of Black girls, that this is not anything new, that Sojourner Truth was indeed speaking about this. This is why we chose to develop this model, but this is also why I'm choosing to use this model now. And also, how are Black girls sort of coping with these sort of current contextual stressors, right? And so racism, being oppressed, being marginalized, experiencing discrimination, all of these things are important when we talk about Black families and stress. The social positioning of Black girls was particularly important for me because Black girls have often been invisible in the research literature. However, I was also interested in variables that I deemed as ordinary magic. And what is ordinary magic? These are the cultural strength-based coping assets that have assisted Black families over time, intentionally. And so it gets at our cultural legacies and histories, the family values, racial socialization, the important role of identity, the important role of kinship, religion, and spirituality, and this collective socialization. And so lastly, how is it impacting adjustment and adaptation where we are currently situated at? So again, the model, the multidimensional construct that I use is very much rooted and tied to my guiding framework in the same way that my guiding framework as a scholar is tied to how I am operationalizing and even thinking about racial socialization. And so that is always important when we talk about being intentional about when we do work with communities of color. And so this leads to the study, and we're going to have some conversation about this. And so this was part of the African American Faiths Community Project under the leadership and a PI, Dr. Pamela Martin, who's at University of South Carolina. We recruited 118 Black girls from 18 predominantly Black churches in 2 Midwestern cities. And participants were really part of a larger group that examined religious and racial socialization practices of Black families. The mean age was 14. Parents on average had an associate's degree, and participants were given $10 for their participation in the study. And so to really understand what was going on with Black girls and the way in which discrimination impacted stigma, I used the racial discrimination scale. And this particular scale had 18 items. It ranges from 0 to 5. But we really wanted to understand the frequency of racial discriminatory experiences in the past year. So for example, being overlooked or not given service in a restaurant or a store, being ignored when you raise your hand in a classroom, police officers sort of harassing you as you are within your neighborhood. So this is just the daily life experiences of racism and how it shows up in the lives of Black Americans. And so I used this scale to understand what Black girls were reporting and why. And then because my socialization of racialized experiences was sort of rooted in a familial racial socialization construct, I wanted to use a scale that got at the things that I was particularly important, that was particularly important for me, but that I knew were strength-based sort of resources for Black families: spirituality and religious coping, extended family caring, kinship, cultural pride reinforcement, and racism and awareness teaching. So spirituality, religion is an important part of a person's life. Extended family caring, spending good time with relatives is as important for parents as it is for children. Black parents should teach their children about racism. That's the cultural pride reinforcement. And racism awareness teaching is that under, sort of analyzing youth's perceptions about if they believe that our society is fair towards Black people. And what's interesting is the scale is that adolescents were sort of ranking how they felt these things were important, which got at the way in which their parents were sort of having these conversations with them. And so this was pretty exciting to see as well. And so for racial stigma, I used a scale that really measured the way in which Black girls sort of internalized these negative attitudes and stereotypes about who they were as a racial group. And so one thing is, one thing I like about a sample question, one thing I like about being Black is the support and sense of togetherness found in Black families. And another one, Black families are just as smart as everyone else. And so this was particularly important for me because I really wanted to understand that, while people are dealing with racism, it is shaping who adolescents are. As you all know, adolescence is a very sensitive stage of development where children are learning who they are and want and who they want to become. And so these encounters of racism can have a negative impact on how they view themselves as being a Black American in today's society. So this was really important for me. And so this leads to, because I'm a visual person, sort of visually what I was interested in. And so you see racial discrimination, if that was associated with racial stigma, and what was the role of racial socialization, like that protective role, that sort of resistance and resilience that I was interested in at the very beginning, the role of spirituality and religiosity, extended family caring, cultural pride reinforcement, and racism awareness teaching. And so from the results, what do we see? So this is just the mean and standard deviation to give you all. But again, adolescents on average, Black girls were age 14. Their parents had an associate's degree on average. They tended to feel healthy. They tended to have sort of these less stigmatized beliefs around the racial stigma. They experienced some amount of racial discrimination. They reported higher levels of spiritual and religious coping. They reported that extended family caring was very important to them. The same thing with cultural pride reinforcement and racial awareness teaching. And so they had about moderate to high levels in the last 4 that you see, and they experienced some amounts of racial discrimination experiences. So these are just the means and standard deviations. But now we get to the real sort of meat of this presentation. And this is a regression analysis that I use to really understand what predicted stigma for Black girls and what was the role of sort of these racial socialization dimensions that I deemed important in protecting Black girls who experience these high levels of racial discrimination. And so I want you to pay attention to what's bolded. And so in step 1, adolescent age was associated with racial stigma. So what this means is that older Black girls were more likely to endorse healthier levels of how they view themselves. So they reported lower levels of being racially stigmatized the older they got. But as we see in step 2, experiencing high levels of racial discrimination led to Black girls feeling more stigmatized about who they are, being almost ashamed of being a person of color. And then we see in step 3 that spiritual and religious coping led to a healthier sense of self, again, less likely to be racially stigmatized, and also this racial awareness teaching. So having the spiritual component and sort of perceiving parents as having these messages about society and being prepared about what you may go through, whether it's in a school setting or neighborhood setting, reduce the likelihood of Black girls endorsing negative racial stigma beliefs about themselves. And so conversations matter. And the last step here, we see a discrimination by cultural pride interaction effect. And I want to show you all visually what that means. And so I want you to pay attention to, and I'm explaining this, and I hope that you all follow me. So we have racial discrimination down here, okay? And we have racial stigma beliefs here. And so if you pay attention here, Black girls with these lower levels of racial discrimination experiences, if you look at these markers here, low cultural pride reinforcement. So that means that these girls in this group, they reported some messages about perceiving cultural pride reinforcement from their parents, but not as much as the others in the moderate group or the high group. And as you see here, if you're reporting low levels of racial discrimination, it really doesn't matter as much. Not to say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter as much if your parents aren't sort of talking to you at these high levels of cultural pride reinforcement. But I want you all to follow this pattern. However, as racial discrimination experiences become higher, those same Black girls whose parents were not endorsing or talking about cultural pride reinforcement, having the conversations about Black history, saying you should be proud to be a person of color, reinforcement, the more they experience high levels of racial discrimination, they become more racially stigmatized. So they are significantly impacted if their parents are not having a conversation with them, but they go out in society and they experience racism. They are less likely to feel confident. They are more likely to feel stigmatized about being a Black American. And so we also see here that even those whose parents report some moderate levels of cultural pride reinforcement, they're doing better than the girls that parents reporting lower levels. But what's interesting to note is that those parents who started at the very onset having these conversations, regardless if the environment was low, medium, or high in racial discrimination, they do better than the other groups. So what this suggests is that these conversations matter. These conversations matter, especially cultural pride reinforcement. And I wanted to sort of go over what that entails. And so it's pretty much Black parents talking about the way in school should be required to teach all children about Black history. Parents should make sure that Black children can see signs of Black culture within a classroom and even within their home environment. That relatives can teach children about Black history. It is this constant reinforcement of pride that is particularly important and matters for Black girls. And so overall, what did I sort of find from this? That racial discrimination was indeed associated with endorsing negative attitudes and beliefs about one's racial group membership. Number two, that spiritual and religious coping was associated with Black girls endorsing less negative attitudes and beliefs about being African American. This is consistent with the previous research literature. That racial awareness and teaching also mattered. And this is the preparation and rejection of negative stereotypes and biases about being Black. This was associated with lower racial stigma beliefs. So again, having these conversations is important. And lastly, cultural pride reinforcement served as a protective factor for Black girls. It was not beneficial. And in fact, Black girls were at risk if their parents did not have this conversation with them. They were more likely to feel stigmatized about who they were. And so right now, the last sort of 2 bullet points is what I want to talk to you all about. So it's pretty exciting work. And so because of this research literature with Black girls, and because we're beginning to understand what's going on, there are scholars that are being very intentional about when they're trying to examine and explore the experiences of Black girls that we need to take into consideration racism and sexism, because that's where we become intersectional at. And Black women and girls comprise marginalized and oppressed identities. And so in a recent study, Stokes found that gendered racial socialization was associated with positive feelings about being Black and less depressive symptomatology. And a sample question from that was, Black women should be proud of being a Black woman. Black girls should be proud of. So it was very, very intentional about the language where that is racially worded, and also there has a gender component to it too. And so lastly, I have a paper that's coming out that's in press that really shows, that racial and gender discrimination was associated with suicide ideation and depressive symptomatology among Black girls. I mean, this is huge because they're dealing with these sort of 2 instances of racial and gender discrimination, which again, I want to add goes back to what Sojourner Truth has always sort of talked about in terms of a woman, in terms of sort of being invisible. And so here we are today sort of having these same conversations and the way that this shows up with Black girls. And so what are some of the limitations with this? And so for me, because I'm a developmental psychologist, I would love to have a large scale longitudinal survey to really look at over time how risk and protective factors are impacting Black girls' social emotional development and who they are. I would, the sample size was small. I recommend a larger sample size as the findings are not generalizable. The study was also based on self-report data, which really didn't allow for like this in-depth examination underscoring the occurrence of using mixed methods, which is very important. And lastly, caution should be taken as the sample is recruited from Black churches. So Black girls within a different contextual setting, such as school or community, or who may not attend church may respond differently, or those who embrace another sort of religious ideology might respond differently. And so those are just some things that to keep into consideration. And so now here's the conversation that I want to have with my researchers who are joining me. And also the next slide is about practitioners and those who serve in who service Black girls in community youth settings. So the first thing we have to do is really to understand that within group diversity is we have to reject white epistemologies and embrace Black girlhood studies. That's what we have to do. We have to advocate for Black girls in understanding what they are sort of going up against within the media, sort of the negative messaging, the classroom experiences, even being adultified. We have to intentionally sort of be intentional about sort of disrupting that narrative. And what I mean by white epistemologies are these white models that are normed on white middle-class girls, and where we're comparing Black girls and their outcomes are always different. But what I've seen what some scholars do is sort of say that Black girls are inferior in some way. We have to unlearn that. And so we have to be intentional about incorporating Black girlhood studies, because Black girlhood studies is this idea of embracing constructivism work. That means centering Black girls' voices through methodologies. We have to be intersectional, looking at racism and sexism and other social identities that Black girls may hold, and also have a liberation lens, an empowering lens, that we empower Black girls to tell their own stories. We have to also look at, and please listen, researchers, and even the practitioners, our positionality. How do we come to this work with Black girls, and how are we being reflexive about what we know and what we don't know? How were we socialized even to think about Black girls? What has our experience been like? If you don't do this, this is going to impact the way in which you perceive Black girls, and even the models, the theory, and everything that you do will shape this. I think it's important for both quantitative and qualitative work, that's the mixed methods, but also the research team composition. If you're doing work with Black girls, then your research team should be reflective of that population. It should, because that's the only way that Black girls are going to feel safe. And we have to consider, again, how we are approaching them. We also have to reflect on the stereotypes and biases of Black girls. How did you come about learning? We have to unlearn focusing solely on race or gender as independent constructs. There are even oftentimes, as I am in an academy, when there are findings that are presented about a certain issue where they are just presenting it by gender, male, female, or they're doing it by race, just the groups. And sometimes I find myself picking which category, but it needs to be intersectional to really understand the experiences of Black girls. Multiple methods are important, being intentional about finding culturally relevant theories and measures, and centering Black girls as knowers of their own experiences, because you don't know. Centering that. Racism and sexism is important, and using community-based participatory methods. Now, for my practitioners, rejecting one-size-fits-all interventions and youth programming. We have to reject that. Evidence-based interventions are useful until they are not. Who's included and who's not in that intervention that works? That's top of the line, 5-star. Was it normed on middle-class white populations? Is the programming centered on white heteronormative values? Again, does your team that services Black girls reflect Black girls, Black women, right? What can organizations do? You want to ensure that your staff reflects the population you're trying to serve, which I've just stated. Reflect on your own biases and stereotypes. For instance, how did you come to this work? How have you been socialized to think about Black girls? Be intentional about developing youth advisory groups. This provides an opportunity for Black girls to lead. Have culturally responsive programming. Center Black girls. Ask them what they want to see. What has their experience been like in programming? So they can sort of come to the table and feel empowered. And so to do this might seem like a lot, but you have to be intentional about creating Black girl space, or we are going to be here 20, 30 years from now, sort of having the same conversation. These are the ways that we can increase the invisibility of Black girls, and that we can center and create Black girl space. And I just want to end with Black girls matter. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheretta. This is a very, very important, I'm restating what was already in the chat, important research. And one of our questions comes from Ellen. We have amazing questions in the Q&A.
Oh, good. Yay.
The first question from Ellen is, how can a white tutor be affirming to young Black girls? Some of this content you've already covered. Yes, but if you would reflect on that.
That's a great question. And I think that, number one, you asking that is a start. And the way in which you can be affirming is that, just allow and create space for Black girls. Just, ask them what are their expectations, what are their sort of lived experiences, what do they want out of this tutoring session, what are their schooling experiences like. And so sometimes Black girls aren't in spaces where, because you can tutor and be an effective tutor, but if we're not really understanding what's sort of happening within school settings that's being disruptive to their learning, right? I think that can be sort of detrimental. So I think being intentional about asking who they are, how they came to you, what is their schooling experience like, I think that way you can create a safe space and you can be intentional about doing that. I just say let adolescents talk. That's my big thing.
And bringing in Autumn's voice, a similar question, but I think it's worth expanding on. She asked, similar to the question about tutoring, which aspects can I help with as a white staff member at a transitional housing facility for youth?
So a couple of things is that I think, again, if Black girls are the population that you service, I think that UND can be of assistance, but I still think that your staff needs to be reflective of the girls that you're trying to serve, because it's all about sort of feeling safe in that particular environment. And not to say that you wouldn't feel that you don't have a safe environment, but in order to sort of hear the lived experiences of Black girls, they want to, to be culturally affirming, they sort of need that connection. And so I would say continue to do what you do, but be intentional about how your staff is sort of approaching Black girls. What are some of the tutoring or some of the methods they're using with that, but also how your staff is reflective of that population. I think that's the biggest thing that I can, that's the most important thing that I can say.
We have a really interesting comment that I want to share with you, and then we'll move to another question. This viewer says, I searched for a Black baby doll for my granddaughter and was surprised that I could not find one without ordering it online. I just wanted her to have a baby that looked like her. There were tons of little white babies, and this broke my heart and opened my eyes, hence why I'm here. I want every opportunity for her to be empowered.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Even thinking about the representation, like representation matters. And I've known folks to sort of demand that stores carry racially and ethnically diverse dolls. But it's been the case where we have to sort of be intentional about getting those dolls, because it's all affirming. And this goes back to Kenneth B. Clark and Mamie Clark with the famous doll experiment. And so how those things are important sort of for self-esteem. But I think that we have to let these organizations know, these businesses know that we want that. And I think there are some places that are a little bit that are getting better, but unfortunately, this is sort of where we're at now still. Yeah.
And then we have Emily asking, is your work in this model applicable to biracial families or biracial girls who may only have one Black parent?
So that's a great question. And so one of the things that I want people to understand is, well, I think it's important to understand is that it is based on how that youth identifies. We kind of have this assumption that because children are biracial, that they might say that identify as being Black. But there are some cases where some biracial children are saying, well, I'm multiracial or I'm that. I think for me, if children intentionally say that they are Black American, like they are Black, then I think this model will work. But I also want you all to know that there's Black racial socialization, but there are models that are on multiracial racial socialization, Latinx racial socialization, AAPI communities, and immigrant populations as well too. And even for queer families as well. And so, yeah, so that's a great question. But I think with that, you want to make sure that your child to see how they identify and move forward with that model. Again, it's about centering youth voices and how they identify themselves.
Thank you.
Sheretta, would you say a bit more? You referenced liberation lens. Would you say a bit more? What is the liberation lens?
Yeah, so liberation lens is really this idea that, without getting too sciencey, where for years we have used these sort of one size fits all models that, you know, experimental is sort of being sort of the gold standard. And we look at, you know, does this intervention work or does it not work? But when you get to an approach, a liberation sort of lens, it is really this idea of centering people's voices and giving them the tools that they can empower themselves and tell their own narrative. And so me as a scholar, my work is always centered on Black families, but I also want to incorporate methods that are empowering so they can feel liberated. So they can feel so they can feel like they can sort of make this change, so they can resist sort of this negative messaging that they're perceiving in larger society, and that they can have these sort of strategies. And so for me, to liberate means to empower and to give you the tools that is important. You know, sometimes in research, you know, we just might go back and we collect data and then we out. I always like to leave my families with something. So that's what I mean by that liberation lens, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
I'm going to read another comment and then a question as well. So the comment is, Dr. Barnes, it's cool to have people who look like Black girls to work with them. But in that boardroom, whiteness is loud and disrespectful to Blackness. I often say when Blackness is offensive, an explanation is always required. We need more seats at the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Cynthia is a good friend of mine, and I have conversations with her about this, but that's what's important. And I think because as a Black woman in these spaces, at WashU, I think this is why it's important for me, and this is why I talked about my positionality to do the work that I do authentically and to be able to tell my story. But you are right, and sometimes it is difficult, and sometimes, you know, you do feel sort of you don't feel empowered, you feel challenged. But I think that if we do have a seat at the table, we also gotta, you know, if we don't have one, we gotta bring one. And then we have to sort of make sure that our voice is heard, especially when it comes to issues around the population that we care about. So I absolutely agree with that. And, you know, I still sort of struggle with that to this day, but I make sure that at least that my voice is heard.
And I wanted to share a question from our friend Alicia Lanier, who's the executive director at Urban Sprouts and an early childhood educator. And she asks, how early should this work and conversations take place with Black girls? I see a strong alliance with this work happening at birth in the early childhood education.
That's right. That's right. So I'm so glad that she asked that question. And so it should happen very early. And as a matter of fact, one of the biggest things in the research literature that we're grappling with is that these conversations are not happening earlier enough, or that we're assessing middle and high school populations. But there's even research that shows that younger kids, by taking them to museums, having art that is reflective, magazine covers, just being culturally affirming, should happen early on. Because guess what? Some of the highest suspension rates in the US are with 4-year-old Black boys. We can't wait. We can't wait. So this has always sort of been an issue. So with Black girls, it's the same way. Black girls are being suspended, Black boys are being suspended. There's hair issues, and you're talking about just, piggybacking on what Cynthia and Jewel were talking about. The Crown Act is particularly important, and this whole standards of professionalism. Those things start early on. So I would say very, very early, it's necessary to do. Scholars have written about this for decades. So great question. Yeah.
Sheretta, in one of your references to publication, there in that article, there was talk about Black girls are denied childhood and are also
yes.
less innocent. Would you mind expanding on that concept?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Black girls have always been sort of adultified since slavery. And there are books about it. One of them is The Incidences of a Slave Girl, that was written by Harriet. I'm blanking on the last name, but this is one of those moments where she was able to sort of retell her story. And so over history, this has happened where just Black girls are not really valued, through the media. We even see this when Solane O'Brien talked about Black girls that are missing, that huge report that came out sometime last year on sort of this inability to have empathy for this group in terms of missing persons report. And so Black girls are often viewed that way. They're viewed as sassy, they're viewed as rude, they're viewed as disruptive, they're viewed as more adult-like, and people sort of play along with it. And it's in our school settings, it's in our neighborhood settings. And what's happened is that this has sort of led, in my opinion, the research literature only focus on Black girls when they're looking at issues of pregnancy, when they're looking at issues of promiscuity, and that's a cultural deficit lens. And it's so rooted in white supremacy and a sort of revisionist history that people are having around the way in which Black girls show up. And so there's a historical piece to that, Cynthia, but it's a very real experience when you have Black girls who are ages 6 or 7 being viewed as if they're 12. And I want to also put a plug in for Monique Morris' documentary, Push Out, that really shows the way in which Black girls are being sort of treated and these stereotypes. Did I answer your question, Cynthia?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay.
So it's no surprise we have a number of clinicians in our audience today. And
okay.
Grace is asking, what would you say is the role of a Black girls therapist in bringing up the issues and the topic of race, racism, and discrimination in a therapeutic setting? And then I'd like to add, was there a different approach if you're a clinician of color versus a white clinician?
So the first thing is that I think that the way in which you can get adolescents, but particularly Black girls, and so because I do work with Black youth, I think one of the ways is that we can just center their voices. And what does that mean? Just ask them every day what's going on, what happened in school. You will begin to, and if we really put on our listening ears, you will begin to understand sort of this intersection of sort of this gendered experiences and this sort of racialized experiences, the way that children are beginning or adolescents beginning to talk about it. So I think as a therapist, even engaging in these conversations, you can allow them that space, or you can simply state in your intake form, you can racism, racial discrimination, perceived racial discrimination, and gender discrimination can be part of the intake form. Are you experiencing this? And then you'll at least have a marker of what's going on. And I think with a white therapist or with a Black therapist, I think the same thing, creating space. But if you want it to be, you can let youth tell their story, or you can be more direct about it by sort of including this in an intake form. I tend to believe that when I work with youth, particularly because I have this experience of within group diversity with Black families, racism and sexism shows up in different ways. And you will believe it or not, I've heard children, Black girls as young as 6 articulating it, the way that they were punished in comparison to someone else. And it's that they can't articulate the sort of scientific term, but they are talking about it. So that's the advice that I would give with that.
Sheretta, when I was working as a consultant in a transitional home, I noticed that when it was time to meet our discipline, Black girl hair products were removed from their access
Yes.
as a form of discipline. So can you talk to that frequency that happens in transitional homes, please?
Yeah. So let me just say this for anybody that is absolutely traumatic. And that is absolutely a dangerous thing to do, because in the Black community, the way in which our hair has been treated and looked at as inferior, and the way in which you've been punished for something that you were God-given, I think is unfair. And what happens with that is that, if you all don't know, so dermatologists would tell you the way that hair textures are different. And that extreme punishment, by taking away those products that work for Black hair, is almost ensuring that our hair will be brittle, that it will break off, that all of these things will happen. And it's a form, it's really, it's punishment that's rooted in white supremacy and slavery. And so I think that's absolutely dangerous. And so even with transitional housing, again, being reflective of the population that you want to serve, having products that is safe for that community. And one of the things, even for Black scholars, as myself, even deciding on the institution to be at, I was like, where are the Black salons at? Where is that Black community at that I'm going to need? And so that is very important, because it's a part of your identity and sort of who you are. And Cynthia, this is not the first time that I heard about this happening. But again, what is this rooted in? And I think unless we address that and people call this stuff out, those things are going to happen. But that is an extreme form of like aggravation and racism and sexism all in one.
Thank you so much.
Here's a really interesting question from Yvette. She's asking, I'm familiar with how Black femininity and how women are allowed to express or relate to their femininity is complicated and nuanced. How would you recommend navigating a Black trans woman's identity being erased within her community? And can you direct resources this way?
Right. I think I think the exact same thing. I think that, number one, communities have to be reflective of who they're trying to serve. I think we need to consider Black trans voices, because they are also often invisible. And I think that we need to create space so that we can understand what are the strength-based, what are the resilience, what are the resisting strategies, and understanding that navigation is going to look different, because that is a population that things aren't really reported on, that issues are not reported in school settings, that often reports they have to choose these binary categories, that we're also dealing with this homophobia, transphobia. So it's these other social identities. But again, being intentional about creating space. And for me, having persons from those communities to service Black girls, I think is important too. It's all about representation.
Thank you. So true.
Sheretta, we are very close to the hour. This has been such an impactful conversation. So I want to ask you, you are a psychologist and a researcher, but you're also a mom. Yes. What has been your greatest frustration having two Black daughters?
Oh, Lord. I think the greatest frustration for me is, I think people not recognizing that they're queens, period, right? I think raising them and still having to have these conversations that my mother had with me when I was 6, or that my grandmother had with her. It's this sort of intergenerational, and it's like, I know we still need to do this, but that's what frustrates me, that, that there are comments about their hair, there are comments about their skin tone that we're still sort of grappling with today. But I make sure that everything that I practice, that I told you all, that I sort of preach, to make sure that they're culturally affirmed, to make sure that I'm centering their voices. And I just want them to grow up in a space in society that loves them for who they are. But if not, I want them to love themselves and be able to pour that into other people. So I think that's my biggest frustration. I think that we're still here having this conversation, but I'm grateful to be part of this conversation, if that makes sense. Yeah.
What a wonderful way to conclude our programming for Black History Month. And Cynthia, because you have been so integral in creating this month-long program, I'd like you to share the last words with our viewers today.
Oh, thank you, Gary. And thank you so much, Dr. Barnes. This has been an amazing month with some amazing experiences that I never expected. I want to thank our audience. I want to thank Janet and Gary, the Clark Fox Policy Forum, the Brown School for all of its support, because without them, this would not have happened. Dr. Barnes, thank you so much for being our closer. Know how much I appreciate you and your work. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. It's beautiful out there. So if you can get out, get out.
That's right. Thank you all. Have a good one.